Good evening, everybody. My name's Brianna Sittler. I am the Director of Special Programs here at Bay Path College. And one of the series I do is the Kaleidoscope series. And I want to express appreciation to People's Bank because they sponsor and contribute to this Kaleidoscope series, making speakers like Gene Baur available to me. And because of their commitment to creating openness, curiosity, and dialogue in your community, our country, and around the world, which I think this talk is definitely going to do. Gene's going to talk for about 45 minutes, then we'll turn up the lights. You're allowed to have Q&A for as long as you want, maybe no more than a half an hour, and then he'll do book signings up here or on the edge. So with that, I'd like to introduce Gene. As the president and co-founder of Farm Sanctuary, the nation's leading farm animal protection organization, Gene campaigns to raise awareness about the negative consequences of industrialized factory farming and our cheap food system. He has conducted hundreds of visits to farms, stockyards, and slaughterhouses to document conditions, and his photos and videos exposing factory farming cruelty have been aired nationally and internationally, educating millions. His book, Farm Sanctuary, is a national bestseller and is a thought-provoking investigation of the ethical questions involved in the production of beef, poultry, pork, milk, and eggs, and what we can do to promote compassion and help stop the systematic mistreatment of 10 billion farm animals who are exploited for food in the U.S. every year. He's not against the small farmer. He believes that they are valuable, they don't mistreat. He encourages, going to your farmer's market and buying locally. And with that, I'd like to invite Gene up to talk. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Brianna, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate your interest in these issues, and I got to say also, I've really enjoyed my time here in Longmeadow. I'm from Los Angeles originally, and we don't have houses that were built in like the 1700s, so it's kind of cool to be here in New England with the history that exists. And actually in my book I talk about where once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. So I really kind of identify with what was happening here a couple hundred years ago when people were stepping up and speaking out against tyranny and cruelty and unfair situation. And that's kind of what we're doing today with factory farming. It is a cruel and unfair situation for animals, for small farmers, for consumers, and it doesn't have to be that way. Since the mid-1980s, I've been spending time visiting farms and stockyards and slaughterhouses to document conditions. And I will be talking about that here as soon as I can find the clicker. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Thought I misplaced it. Oh, man. So, but I'll start with some pictures of animals at Farm Sanctuary. And Farm Sanctuary is a place where the animals are our friends, not our food. They get to enjoy their lives. We take care of them like most people take care of their cats and dogs. So if they get sick, we take them to the veterinarian. And let's see here. I got to point it that way. And so, and they get to know us and they get to trust us. Now, and they get to be who they are. So cows get to go out and graze. Pigs get to go out and root in the soil. And you see these guys just coming back from a fun playing out in the field. And, when the animals first come to us, they're oftentimes afraid because all they have known with human experience has been pain and cruelty and fear. On these farms, they're routinely mutilated. They have parts of their bodies cut off, like their tails or parts of their ears, or if they're chickens or turkeys, parts of their toes or parts of their beaks. And this is done without any painkillers. And so their experience with people has not been a pleasant one. So at first they're somewhat standoffish. But as time goes, they learn that they're in a safe place, and they begin to trust us, and they begin to enjoy life. They begin to play. And they also begin to show love and companionship. And we had a turkey out in California that we used to call Lydia the hugging turkey, because you'd go out to the barn and she would come up to you and she would crane her neck around your neck like she was giving you a hug. And cows and pigs and chickens and turkeys and goats and sheep and these farm animals are very much like cats and dogs. We have sheep at the farm, for example, and when you're petting them, they really enjoy it. And you see their tails wagging. And when you stop petting them, they start pawing at you, saying, "Come on, pet me more, pet me more." similar to like somebody's cat or dog might do. And, dogs and cats and farm animals all have memories, emotions. They develop relationships. When you're going to take your dog out for a walk or feed your dog, for example, they will often get very excited. They know what's happening and they like the idea of it. Same thing with farm animals. When they're about to get fed or maybe moved into a new pasture where there's new fresh grass, they'll be very excited. And so they, are living, feeling creatures with feelings. Now, I didn't grow up on a farm. I actually grew up in Los Angeles, California, and I had a cat. His name was Tiger. And I loved my cat. And where I grew up in the Hollywood Hills, I saw wild animals. I saw deer, coyotes, skunks, raccoons, and I really loved the wild animals too. But despite being, having an affection for animals, I also ate animals. And I didn't really give a lot of thought to what I was eating. And I never made a conscious choice to eat animals. But, we grow up in a society where that is normal. My parents were eating animals. My brothers and sisters were eating animals. Everybody I knew was eating animals, so I started eating animals without really thinking about it. But as time went, and as I recognized that I could live and do very well by eating only plant foods and no animal foods, I decided to become a vegan in 1985, and since that time I've survived and done quite well eating just plant foods. So I eat fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, seeds, and beans, and get everything I need through these plant foods and don't have any desire to eat any animal foods. And as I've looked more into these issues, I've learned just how harmful our animal farming business is. And it harms animals, it harms ourselves, and it also harms our planet. I've got a couple of slides here from a book called The China Study. And for anybody interested in the science behind the benefits of plant-based eating, I would recommend The China Study. It was written by Colin Campbell, who's a nutritional biochemist at Cornell University. His study, The China Study, was called The Grand Prix of Epidemiology by the New York Times. It's the most comprehensive study ever done to look at human health and nutrition. And what he found was that we are basically vegetarians as a species. We historically have eaten meat, but if you look at our bodies, we're better designed to eat plant foods than animal foods. If we were naturally carnivores and we saw an animal who was injured and bleeding and dying, we would start salivating. But that's not generally what we do. There was a book some years ago that had this introduction that said, if you take a child and put him in a room with a rabbit and an apple, and if he eats the rabbit and plays with the apple, I'll buy you a car. And so, naturally speaking, we tend to, be drawn more towards plant foods and be somewhat repulsed by the blood and guts that are required to kill animals and consume them. But this slide from the China study shows healthcare expenditures in the U.S. versus in other countries, and we can see that in the U.S. they're very high. And our healthcare expenditures have continued to go up, and this ends in 1997, but the expenditures continue going up and are one of the major causes and contributors to our difficult economic situation right now. It's been estimated that we could save something like 70 to 80% on our healthcare costs by shifting to a whole foods plant-based diet and away from the typical American diet. And if you look at the way we're eating in our country today, it's really quite illogical and irrational. We're eating food that makes us sick. Heart disease is the #1 killer in this country, and the risk of that can be seriously lessened by shifting towards eating plant foods and away from animal foods. I don't know if anybody here saw that 1-hour special on CNN that was hosted by Sanjay Gupta. It featured President Bill Clinton, and the title of it was called The Last Heart Attack. And in that documentary, they discussed and posited the notion that we could eliminate heart disease in this country by shifting to eating plant foods instead of animal foods. So the way we eat has profound impacts on our own health, and it's something that it's important, I think, to think about. At a certain age in our country, a lot of people end up taking heart medication, Lipitor or whatever. And if everybody's doing it, we think it's normal. But it doesn't have to be normal. And the message here is that we can be empowered by our food choices. We could eat well and feel better physically, as well as emotionally, and I'll get a little bit more into that a little later on. So besides our health, the environment is impacted by our agricultural system. These are some findings from a report called Livestock's Long Shadow that was published by the United Nations. And what the UN found was that the livestock sector emerges as one of the top 2 or 3 most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale, from local to global. Livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions in CO2 equivalent. This is a higher share than transport. So if you take all the planes and trains and boats and combine all of the emissions that come from all these transportation sectors, it's less than the amount of emissions that come from animal agriculture. So it's very good that people are carpooling and taking public transportation or biking or walking or telecommuting, but shifting how we eat can have an even greater impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. Some more findings from the United Nations are that findings of the report suggest that the livestock sector should be a major policy focus when dealing with problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. Livestock's contribution to environmental problems is on a massive scale, and its potential contribution to their solution is equally large. The impact is so significant that it needs to be addressed with urgency. And animal farming is inherently more resource intensive than plant-based farming. In order for us to raise animals for food, we have to grow lots and lots of grains. And the vast majority of corn and soybeans that are produced in the United States are now being used as animal feed. And we have a very poor conversion rate on that. It's something like, for every, we could get about 6 or 10 times more nutrients if we just ate the plant foods directly instead of feeding them to the animals. So we're wasting enormous amounts of energy and water and other resources to grow crops to feed to animals. If we ate those plant foods directly, it would make an awful lot more sense. There was a New York Times article a couple years ago that was entitled Rethinking the Meat Guzzler, and in that article, the author compared the amount of fossil fuels needed for a vegetarian meal versus a meat meal. He found it took 16 times more fossil fuels to produce the meat meal. So again, it's been recognized that in our country we have a sort of addiction to oil, but what has not been adequately recognized is how that addiction to oil is driven in no small part by our addiction to animal foods. And all these problems have been exacerbated by a push over the last 50 or so years to get big or get out. That has been a USDA mantra. It has been an agribusiness mantra. And so small farms have been pushed out of business and replaced by these larger, more industrialized operations that are bad for animals, bad for people, bad for workers, and bad for the environment. Now, when Farm Sanctuary first started back in 1986, I felt it was important to see firsthand what was happening. So I started visiting farms and stockyards and slaughterhouses to document conditions. And I spent a lot of time at Lancaster Stockyards in Pennsylvania. And what was apparent was that the way I looked at these animals was very different than the way the stockyard workers looked at these animals. I would look in their face and I would see their fear. I would see that they had feelings and emotions. And that's what I was concerned about, the fear that these animals were exhibiting. The stockyard workers were not looking at their faces. They were looking at their body parts. They're looking literally at muscle conformation, at pieces of meat. They're looking at them as commodities, not as living, feeling creatures. And, and I think it's important for us to recognize that these are living, feeling animals, not just commodities. And that's really where the big issue is here. Years and years ago when they had the Salem witch hunts, the executioners who were executing the accused witches were told, don't look into their eyes, because if you do, they'll cast a spell on you and you won't be able to kill them. So, I think it's important to look into their eyes and to have empathy, because we naturally have empathy as human beings. And I think that is our better qualities, and something that we encourage people to own and to build. It's like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. But at the stockyard, these animals are just seen as commodities, and many of them die. And behind the stockyard, there's something called the dead pile, where they have the dead animals. And here we see some dead sheep, a dead cow. There's also dead pigs to the left of this frame that are out of the picture. But as I approached this pile, you could literally hear the maggots buzzing. They were so thick. It was a hot, muggy August day. It smelled terrible, as you can imagine. And off this pile, the sheep here at the far right, she lifts her head. And she was alive. So we took her off the dead pile and found a veterinarian to look at her, thinking she'd probably have to be euthanized. But as he started examining her, she perked up. And she ended up standing up, and that's her. That's Hilda, who's our first rescued animal. Now, she had been considered a downed animal. And they call them downed animals because they're down on the ground and they're too sick or weak even to stand. And so we started a campaign to prevent these downed animals from being marketed and slaughtered for human food. Because at the time, and this was specifically at Lancaster Stockyards, the largest stockyard east of Chicago at the time in the mid-1980s. And they would be unloaded, they'd be dragged off of trucks, sometimes with chains, then they'd be dragged back onto trucks and taken to slaughterhouses, or they would be left in alleyways or in pens to die of neglect, or they'd be left on the dead pile. And we thought that that was wrong. We felt that if these animals deserve better, they should either be humanely euthanized or they should be given proper veterinary care. They shouldn't be left to die of neglect, and they shouldn't be taken to slaughter. So we started a campaign, and at the time, Lancaster Stockyards was getting ready to celebrate its 100-year anniversary. It was a pillar of the community. And meanwhile, it was being criticized by this upstart new vegan organization run by a couple of vegans that lived in a school bus on a tofu farm. And the way we funded it in the early days was by selling vegetarian hot dogs at Grateful Dead concerts. So, we had our work to do to convince people that our concerns were valid. But as time went and as we took pictures and showed people in the community what was happening, things started turning, and people recognized that Lancaster Stockyards was not all that great ultimately, and these animals were being mistreated there. And we were finally able to get them convicted of cruelty to animals. And I went back to Lancaster a few years ago, and I took this picture. It was overgrown, and it's now been bulldozed. It is no longer there. Meanwhile, Farm Sanctuary has grown, and this is our farm in Watkins Glen, New York, and you're all welcome and invited to come visit. We have 175 acres. We have bed and breakfast cabins. We do events. And you can come to the farm and spend time with the animals. You get a chance to give a pig a belly rub. It's pretty fun. Go out to the pig barn. These are big animals, like 500-pound animals. And you start rubbing their belly, and they'll plop over just like a puppy dog. And they start grunting and happy sounds. So that's our farm in Watkins Glen, New York. And we also have a farm in Orland, California. It's about 100 miles north of Sacramento. It's a 300-acre facility. And again, we have an overnight cabin, we do events, and people are welcome to come visit, tour the farm, meet the animals, and learn about these issues. And we also recently acquired a place just outside of Los Angeles in the town of Acton. So we now have 3 facilities that we operate, and they're all open to the public, and people are encouraged to visit. But a long way from Farm Sanctuary, on today's factory farms, bad has become normal. Farm animals are genetically manipulated, artificially bred, mutilated, confined, cruelly beaten, and ultimately killed for food. Farm animals are specifically excluded from the Federal Animal Welfare Act. I think most people are pretty surprised to hear this. Most people assume and want to believe that these animals are protected, right? Well, no, they're actually excluded from the Federal Animal Welfare Act. And at the state level, agricultural practices considered to be common are excluded from most state anti-cruelty laws. And what is a common agricultural practice? It's something that agribusiness just starts doing. And if enough of them do it, it's common. And it's considered legal no matter how cruel it is. So we have dealt with some pretty egregious abuses that have been considered legal and acceptable because they're common agricultural practices. And then finally, just to give you a sense of how influential and powerful agribusiness is exempt from many labor and environmental laws. The farm minimum wage is less than the minimum wage in other sectors, for instance. So this is an industry that's very entrenched, that has come to accept bad things as normal, and then is now starting to defend these bad things, and is in fact even trying to pass laws to make it illegal to take pictures on farms to conceal what they're doing and prevent people from discussing and thinking about what happens to animals on these factory farms. And I think it's important for people to know and to be able to make informed choices. and ultimately to make choices that are aligned with our own values, that we can feel good about. I think it's very telling that when we start raising the issue of factory farming and what happens to animals, people oftentimes say, don't tell me, I don't want to know. It's too upsetting. And that's because we are naturally empathetic. Human beings, that's one of our best qualities is empathy and to care for others. And by saying, don't tell me, I don't want to know, that's choosing to live in denial. And I don't think that's a very good choice, frankly. I think we need to be responsible and live in a way, ideally, that we can feel good about, and saying, don't tell me, I don't want to know. And in addition to living in a way aligned with our values, we should, I think, make choices that are more aligned with our own interests, and to eat food that doesn't make us sick, and to support an agricultural system that does not cause so much harm to the planet. So after our campaign at Lancaster Stockyards, after we were able to get them convicted, and now, as I mentioned, they're closed, I traveled around the country to document what was happening with downed animals. And that's a picture I took at a slaughterhouse in Southern California. These are down dairy cows who are sent to the slaughterhouse to be killed and sold for human food. Most of these dairy cows, when they're no longer profitable in milk production, are slaughtered for ground beef and turned into hamburger. That's a picture of a down cow that I took in Texas. She was sent to the stockyard with her calf. And because cows and calves sell to different buyers, they were separated. And the mother fought to be with her calf, as mothers tend to do. They want to protect their young. And as she struggled to be with her calf, her neck was broken. And so she was left there to suffer for who knows how long. And they refused to humanely euthanize her because as long as she was still alive, she could be sold for human food. And that's another picture I took this is in upstate New York. This is a calf who was sent to the stockyard on the day he was born. He was still wet from afterbirth, and it was a freezing day, and he was basically dying of hypothermia. So I went up to the stockyard worker and I said, so what's going on with this calf? He said, well, I got to bury him later today. So I said, what if I take him off your hands? And he said, sure, go ahead, take him. So I took the calf to a nearby veterinarian, and she tried to take his temperature. It was so low, it wouldn't even read on a thermometer. And she said, what are you wasting your time for? This calf is going to cost a lot more than he's worth. It makes no economic sense. And I said, well, to me, this is not about economics. This is an individual. I want to do what I can to help him. And she finally agreed to treat him and give him intravenous fluids. And then I took him back to Farm Sanctuary and took care of him. And I'm happy to say that he recovered completely. That's Opie. He ended up weighing close to 3,000 pounds and had a long, happy life at the farm. And it was beautiful to go out into the barn and see him. He was, he was huge. I mean, he was like this high at his shoulder. And we have these 10 by 10 foot doors in one of our barns, and he would stand in that door and he would basically take up the whole space. But he was very gentle, and he lived with us for nearly 20 years. He died a couple years ago, but it was great to see him on the farm and to know what kind of a life he's lived. But Opie's life began on a dairy farm. For cows to produce milk, they have to have a calf. And on modern dairies, they're forced to have a calf every year. And these cows are pushed very hard to produce about 10 times more milk than they would produce in nature. They're hooked up to milk machines 2 or 3 times a day, and their bodies become very depleted and worn out. In a healthy environment, a dairy cow could live around 20 years. But on these modern factory farms, these cows are sent to slaughter after just about 3 years in production. And by that time, sometimes they are so worn out, they can't even stand, and they are the downed cows. And that's actually a picture of a downed cow being loaded onto a truck from a dairy farm to be taken to slaughter. And this picture was taken by a dairy industry veterinarian who was upset by what he was seeing, and he took the picture and he sent it to me, and he said, this is horrible, we got to do something to stop this. So we've been campaigning for decades to prevent the inhumane treatment of these downed animals. We have had some success, I'm happy to say. It is now illegal for downed cows to be slaughtered and used for human food. But it's still legal for downed pigs and other downed animals to be slaughtered and used for human food. So that is something that we're continuing to work on, but we have made some progress there. And one of the reasons that we're successful on preventing downed cows from going into the food supply was because there's a concern about mad cow disease. And since the early 1990s, we argued that there was evidence that we might have a variant of mad cow disease in the United States. The USDA kept saying, no, we don't have it, there's no evidence. So we actually went to court and we sued them. And our position was that downed animals are diseased, and diseased animals cannot legally be used for human food. Their response to us was that we were incorrect and that it was legal and appropriate and common for diseased animals to be used for human food. And they also said, and there's no evidence of mad cow disease in this country. So we're going back and forth. Our case was dismissed a few times, and then we finally won an appellate decision that would have allowed our case to go forward. This was December 16th, 2003. And so this is on December 16th, and this would have allowed us to go into discovery, to get into their files, to learn what they knew about downed cows and mad cow disease. And less than 2 weeks later, the USDA admitted they found mad cow disease in a downed cow in Washington state. And they made that known on Christmas Eve, December 24th, a real big media day. And we then entered into negotiations with the USDA, and they agreed in 2004 to prevent downed cows from going to the food supply. There were a few loopholes in their policy that had to be tightened up later on, but it took a court case and it took the discovery of mad cow disease ultimately for us to succeed in this. And unfortunately, agribusiness is very slow to make any changes, and also unfortunately, the USDA is very closely aligned with agribusiness. They have sort of two missions. One is to promote nutritious food, and one is to promote farm products. And they tend to do the idea of promoting farm products in a much more significantly than protecting human health. In fact, back in the 1970s, there was a commission of experts put together by Senator McGovern that came up with nutritional guidelines for our country. And their recommendation was that we Americans should eat less meat. Now, that report was in print for about 1 day, and then it was changed to say that we should eat more meat that's lower in saturated fat. So it kind of reshaped the entire message. And unfortunately, we've continued to eat more meat, and our health has continued to deteriorate. But as I mentioned, these dairy cows are pushed very hard. They have a calf every year. Half of the calves born are male. And because they're male, they will never become milking cows. And so the veal industry was actually created to take advantage of this plentiful supply of unwanted male calves born on dairy farms. So the male calf is taken from his mother at birth and chained by the neck in one of these wooden crates, and that's where he lives his entire life. And then he's sent to slaughter and sold as veal. Thankfully, there's been a lot of education about veal, and as people have learned about it, they say, I don't want to support it, and veal consumption has dropped significantly. And that's just, one example of how human beings are humane and do not want to support cruelty. The fact that when people learn about this, they don't want to support it. But veal calves aren't the only animals that are confined this way. That's a picture I took of breeding pigs in Missouri. They're in gestation crates, and these are 2-foot wide metal enclosures where they're forced to live during their gestation period or their pregnancy, which lasts about 4 months. Then right before giving birth, they move them into what's called a farrowing crate, where the sow is also just given 2 feet of space, but there's some additional space on the side for the piglets. So while the mother is laying on her side, the piglets can nurse through the bars, and they will do that for about 3 weeks. Then the babies are taken away to be fattened for slaughter, and they're usually killed at about 6 months old. The mother is immediately reimpregnated, put right back into the gestation crate. So she lives a constant cycle of impregnation, birth, and reimpregnation, going back and forth between the gestation crate and the farrowing crate. Now, these animals suffer both physically and psychologically. On this one, you can see some bruising on her front leg. And they also sometimes have sores on their bodies from scraping against the metal bars of their cages. And they also suffer psychologically and are driven to neurotic coping behaviors like bar biting, as we see here. Again, these are very intelligent animals, and they're forced to endure this inhumane confinement for practically their whole lives. And the other confinement system I'll mention are battery cages. And this is how egg-laying hens are kept in these cages that are lined up in rows, stacked in tiers in huge factory warehouses. Each bird is given less than a sheet of paper space to stand on. About 2/3 of a sheet of paper is the amount of space they get. They can't stretch their wings. They can't engage in basic natural behaviors. Their feathers wear off from constantly scraping against the wire bars. And they'll live this way for about a year. Now, there are two distinct breeds of chickens today, but they all begin their lives at these hatcheries, where they're hatched in these incubators. One strain of chickens has been genetically bred to grow twice as big and twice as fast as normal, and they're used for meat production. And they use both the males and the females. The other strain of chickens have been genetically bred for egg production, to put all of their feed energy into eggs. So they don't get very big, they don't grow very fast. So when you go to hatcheries that hatch these egg-laying hens, you have females and males. The females are used for egg production. The males are useless to the egg industry because they don't lay eggs, and they don't grow fast enough to be raised profitably for meat. So they are literally thrown away right after they hatch. And that's a picture I took of a dumpster behind a hatchery in Pennsylvania that was just throwing away these unwanted male chicks. Here's another picture at a hatchery of unwanted male chicks that have been thrown into a manure spreader to be spread on the field like manure. Here's a picture I took in New Jersey, and this was at an egg factory, and I went there mainly to take pictures of the battery cages. But as I was getting ready to leave, I came across this trash can of dead birds, and that's pretty typical. You see dead birds on these places all the time. But in this case, a couple of them were alive. So I took them out and brought them to Farm Sanctuary. And then we tried to prosecute this egg factory for cruelty to animals. And when we got to court, their lawyer argued that they could legally treat the birds like manure. And the judge said, isn't there a difference between live birds and manure? And their attorney said, no, legally there is no difference. And that egg factory was ultimately found not guilty of cruelty to animals. There was another case in Southern California where there was an egg factory that had 30,000 spent hens. And these are hens that have been laying eggs for about a year. Then their egg production rates drop off, and so it's not as profitable for the egg farm, so the birds are killed. And there have been times when they've been sent to slaughterhouses and killed for chicken pot pies and low-grade chicken meat products. But increasingly, these slaughterhouses don't want these skinny, worn out, beat up, spent hens. They want to be killing these heavy meat type birds. It's just more profitable. And there's a plentiful supply of these meat birds now. So oftentimes these egg laying operations have a hard time getting rid of these unwanted spent hens. There's no slaughterhouse market for them anymore. So sometimes they just literally throw them into landfills. And there was a case in California where an egg factory had 30,000 spent hens, and what he did was he got a wood chipper. And he threw the live birds into the wood chipper to kill them. A neighbor saw this and was appalled and contacted us and other authorities, and we tried to get this guy prosecuted for cruelty to animals, but he was ultimately found not guilty because that was considered to be a common practice. So again, on today's farms, bad has become normal. And there's a quote from a book called Animal Machines I think is very fitting. If one person is unkind to an animal, it's considered to be cruelty. But where a lot of people are unkind to animals, especially in the name of commerce, the cruelty is condoned, and once large sums of money are at stake, will be defended to the last by otherwise intelligent people. So that's the situation we have now. Bad has become normal. And we have come to accept things that I think need to be questioned and need to be challenged. I think we need to think critically and not just go along with what is happening. And I'm talking about people in production agriculture, but I'm also talking about consumers. You know, it's not normal, or it doesn't need to be normal, to have to take Lipitor or take heart medication at a certain age. If we live well, we don't need that stuff. And it doesn't have to be normal to mutilate and mistreat and confine these animals the way they're confined on these factory farms. I think we need to step back and think about what we're doing. But us human beings are very much social animals. We tend to do what those around us do. You know, as I mentioned before, I grew up eating meat because everybody around me was eating meat. But I wasn't thinking very much about it. I just sort of did what everybody was doing. Once I started thinking about it, I did things differently. So I think what we need to do is really be critical thinkers and make choices that feel right and that are aligned with our own values. So we don't have to say, don't tell me about it. And instead we can say, I know what I'm buying and I feel good about it. And also eat food that makes us healthy instead of food that makes us sick. that's in our interest. So the last animal production system I'll mention are the chickens raised for meat. Every year there are about 9 billion chickens who are raised and slaughtered for meat in our country. 9 billion. That's an enormous number. And these birds have been genetically bred, as I mentioned before, to grow twice as big and twice as fast as normal. They grow so fast and so large that their hearts and lungs have a hard time supporting that kind of growth rate. And every year, millions die of heart attacks at just a couple weeks old. And for those that grow old enough and big enough, their feet and legs have a hard time supporting their growth, their weight. So these birds suffer immeasurably throughout their lives. And their overweight condition and poor health somewhat perversely parallels our own in this country. And I've got a series of slides here now from the Centers for Disease Control showing rates of obesity. Starting in 1985, and you see the darker blue colors indicate 10 to 14% of the adult population obese. By 1990, we see the states with this problem increasing. By 95, we have a new darker blue color indicating a higher percentage of the adult population considered to be obese. By 2000, we have a new color showing that the problem just continues to expand and get worse. 2006, we have new colors. And this is the last slide I have available, but the problem has continued to get worse up until today. So this is a problem, and the current generation of children is believed that they will have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. This is tragic, and it doesn't have to be this way. By eating a whole foods plant-based diet, we can shift away from supporting these factory farms and eating food that makes us sick. It's really, heart disease and cancer are the top 2 killers in our country, and the risks of both can be seriously lessened by shifting to a plant-based diet. And in addition to our own health, there's sort of our own emotional health, in a sense. When we treat other animals badly, or when we treat other people badly, there's a tendency to want to validate it and justify it and legitimize it and come up with reasons why it's okay for us to do what we're doing. And in the case of farm animals, there's a tendency to denigrate them and say, well, they don't deserve any better. They're really stupid and they don't really have feelings anyway. But those are self-serving rationalizations that have no basis in reality. One of the myths that's out there is that turkeys are so dumb that when it rains, they'll go outside and they'll look up in the rain and they'll drown. Some of you have possibly heard this. I remember hearing it a lot. Well, we've raised turkeys for 25 years now, and they can go outside, they can come inside, and we've never had one go outside and look up in the rain and drown. So these animals are actually quite intelligent, they're quite curious, and they're interested in their world. So we start rationalizing. And one of the first visitors to our farm in Watkins Glen, New York, was a pig farmer. And he went into our pig barn and he saw some volunteers taking care of these 500-pound sows. And he was genuinely worried about our volunteers' health. He said, those are dangerous, aggressive animals. Those pigs will attack you. And I told him that, at Farm Sanctuary, we've never had pigs attacking us the way he's describing. I said they sometimes come in and are afraid, but we just give them their space and let them know that they're in a safe place, and over time they come to trust us. And he said, look, he's raised pigs for years, he understands these animals, he knows them, and they're violent and dangerous and aggressive animals. You can't trust them. And to illustrate his point, he told a story about how he had a sow who had babies, and he took the babies away, and the sow came after him. And he used that example to make the case that these are violent and aggressive animals, without seeing how his behavior caused this reaction. So we human beings have an amazing capacity for deluding ourselves into believing things that aren't necessarily true. And another example from the pig industry is that the reason they use these farrowing crates for the mother sows and the piglets, where the sow has 2 feet of space and there's a little space on the side for the piglets so the piglets can nurse through the bars, the reason they use those is because they believe that these sows will hurt their young. The sow cannot raise her young, so we have to put them in the crate, otherwise they will step on them and they will injure them and kill them. They really believe this. So, kind of to dismiss that notion, is Nikki, a pig that lives at Farm Sanctuary. She was actually confined in gestation crates in Iowa on factory farms, gestation crates, farrowing crates, and so on. And she was pregnant in her gestation crate when the floods came to Iowa a few years ago. I think it was 2008. And many pigs sadly died in their confined situations. They couldn't escape. But she and a number of others were able to escape. And here you have this pregnant sow now released from her gestation crate during the floods in Iowa. What does she do? She looks for high ground. She gets up on a levee. She looks for brush and sage. And she gets into this brush. And she gives birth. And she raises her young and nurses her young on the levee in the midst of this flood. So we sent a team out there and brought her to Farm Sanctuary. And when we go out to the barn to be with Nikki, do you think she attacks us like this guy was describing? No, not at all. She knows she's in a safe place. And so, the animals at Farm Sanctuary are happy, and you can actually see them smile. And they get to be who they are and express themselves. And, pigs get to go build nests, for example, which they would naturally do. So kindness to animals is good for the animals, but it's also good for us. I'd much rather be with a pig or an animal like this than one who's kept behind bars, who's, struggling to get out and who's unhappy and who's constantly stressed. That sort of thing rubs off on us. And, human beings are social animals. We rub off on each other, but we also rub off on the animals who are around us, and they rub off on us. And if you're in a peaceful environment, it's very different than being in a factory farm environment, which is so violent. And, in our world, there are many things that we don't have a lot of control over. It's hard to stop wars that are happening in distant lands and so on. But something each of us has a lot of control over is what we eat. And every day, each of us make choices about our food that have profound impacts on other animals, on our own health, and also on the environment. So I've got a few quotes here I really like. I'll just read. Each snowflake in an avalanche pleads not guilty. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. And how wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. And one of my mantras is, you can't control others, you can only control yourself. So I think it's important for us just to think about our own actions and be responsible for them, and ultimately to make choices that we can feel good about, that are aligned with our values, and also that are healthy and aligned with our interests. And another quote I really like from Margaret Mead is, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever does. And thankfully, there is now starting to be some change. More and more people are recognizing the benefits of eating lower on the food chain, eating more plants, fewer animal products. People even like Bill Clinton now is a vegan. So you have lots and lots of folks recognizing, and for Bill Clinton, it's the health reasons. He had serious heart problems, and by shifting to a whole foods plant-based diet, he's now lost a lot of weight. He's feeling a lot better. And so for him, this was very important to get his health in a better place. But for a lot of other people, it's ethics, who say, I don't want to support that kind of cruelty, or environmental. Why should we support a system that's destroying the planet, that is so wasteful, that is squandering scarce resources? And as time goes, we're going to have fewer and fewer finite resources, fossil fuels, fresh water, things like that. And as more and more people get this message and hear about these issues and start making more conscientious choices, all the animals at Farm Sanctuary say thank you and invite you to come visit. So I'll close it with that and open it up to questions, and thank you all very much for being here. All right, questions, comments, and I guess...
So if you have a question, if you can stand up one at a time and just really clearly say it, and if you could repeat it, Gene.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Hi.
Did you find some, when you visited these farms, did you get some pushback? I'm sure you weren't welcome in this place. Did they know what you were in fact doing, or how were you received?
Yeah, how was I received at these farms when I visited them? Did I get pushback? Did they know who I was? Oftentimes I would go in there just sort of asking questions, saying, what are you doing? And in the mid-'80s, there was less sort of an awareness that they had about the fact that people like I were concerned about what they were doing. So early on, it was not as difficult. In recent years, though, they've become more and more upset about the fact that people are exposing what happens at these farms. And there have been times when I've been pushed around and threatened in various ways. And they're now trying to pass laws to make it illegal to take pictures at these farms. So there's been a shift. I think they just didn't really think very much about it before. Now they are very concerned about people taking pictures, and oftentimes when they see somebody with a camera, they will go ballistic. So yeah, there's quite a lot of pushback.
You argue that nutritionally it's probably not healthy for us to be eating a lot of these animals. But one would argue the same case for plants, because plants are not grown the way that they were grown 100 years ago, and they're just as chemically tainted as the animals. And if we don't live near local farms, what have you, we are limited in terms of what we can find. So my question to you is, how do you maintain a healthy diet with on both sides?
Yeah, the point has to do with, I argue that eating animal foods is not healthy, but what about the point that some plant foods are also raised in basically monocrop, factory-type environments where they may also be devoid of necessary nutrients? And for a lot of people, they might not be near local farms, so how can they get good produce? Well, thankfully, the organic market is growing, and produce that's grown in healthy organic soil is going to tend to have micronutrients and other things that are very good for us. Our food system has been very reductionist, where, for instance, and marketed in such a way, like you go and see, cereal boxes that say 8 essential vitamins, right? So they take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But those vitamins oftentimes come in nature in a package. There's like micronutrients. There's, that's why eating whole foods is so important. And we also have enriched foods, right? Like enriched white bread or enriched whatever the product might be, because all the good stuff's been taken out and then we enrich it with the chemicals we know. So the way I deal with it is I just try to eat a whole foods plant-based diet, and some of the superstar vegetables are leafy greens. And so I get these from the local health food store, and I get organic kale, for example, and I make these green smoothies with kale and spinach, and I put bananas and blueberries, and then some kind of non-dairy milk, like an almond milk or a soy milk or an oat milk or a hemp milk or a rice milk. Blend that up with flax seeds. That's a really healthy, tasty meal. And it's sweet. And if I want it sweeter, I'll put dates in there. It's good stuff. And also, say on a hot summer day, a fresh peach, that's pretty darn flavorful. So just eating, and I've gotten everything I've needed by eating plant foods. So I think, it's a matter of choice, and your taste buds adjust, and you start thinking differently about food, and, we can become addicted to sugar, like when there's cookies around, I'll tend to eat them, but it's sugar, and at the end of the day, that's not so great. So just because something tastes really good, and, we can actually become addicted to that stuff. We evolved to want to eat lots of sugar and fat because it's usually high in calories. So as a species over, hundreds of thousands of years, that's been kind of what we're drawn to. And these food manufacturers know that, so they put sugar and salt and fat in our food. But that's killing us. So it's good to kind of retrain ourselves to eat an apple and say, that tastes good. Instead of saying, I don't want an apple, I want a cookie. You can only eat so many cookies before you really start feeling it in a bad way. And so, when I first went vegan, I wasn't eating as healthy as I could have. I would take, boil up a big pot of noodles at the beginning of the week and I have it in the fridge, and I just grab a handful of noodles, put them on a plate with margarine and zap it in the microwave. Not the healthiest meal. So I'm now trying to do a better job of eating a variety of whole plant foods. So fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts, seeds. Like for breakfast, I'll have oatmeal with soy milk and raisins and walnuts. So it's sweet with those raisins in there. You can also, so that's a really good thing. You could have like spaghetti and meatballs without the meatballs and just add veggies instead. Or you could get meatless meatballs. There's also veggie hot dogs now and veggie burgers now. So there's all kinds of, it's getting easier and easier. So it's, but you get everything you need, yeah.
Can you speak to how much more humane is it to raise an organic cow or an organically raised chicken for organic chicken?
Yeah, how much more humane is organic versus conventional? You know, unfortunately, organic is not necessarily that much better, and that's why it's so important to get to know who is raising these animals, and why if you are going to eat animal products, to go to farmers markets and get to ideally visit the places where the animals are coming from, because oftentimes these labels tend to sound a lot better than they are. And you know, right now there's such strong demand for alternatives to factory farmed meat. So you have a strong demand and not a very big supply. So you have a lot of these products that are actually coming from places that are very much like factory farms. And in terms of organic and free range, technically what that requires is that animals be given access to the outdoors. But access to the outdoors is not well defined. So you can have literally thousands of animals in a warehouse with a tiny little door that goes to a crummy little paddock. That's technically access to the outdoors, and that's therefore organic or free range. And oftentimes you'll have chickens that are raised in these free range farms or cage-free egg farms, and they're still debeaked. Parts of their beaks are cut off because they're packed so tightly that they would peck each other. So, you know, those labels unfortunately tend to sound better than they are. And the only way really to know is to visit the facilities, get to know the farmers, and find out what's happening. And here in Massachusetts, I think you have a lot of farmers markets. And I think farmers markets are popping up all over the country. It's a very, very positive sign because it's connecting farmers more closely to consumers. And that's good because there's more transparency. And ideally, you know, my view is it makes the most sense just to eat plant foods and not animal foods. But everybody's going to make their own choices. And if people are going to be buying animal foods, it's better to go to those kinds of places as opposed to more commercial retail outlets where it might even say organic. Now, I will also say, though, that buying organic, even if the animals aren't treated all that well, is sending a market signal. So it's still better than just buying conventional, because what you're doing is you're basically showing that citizens care about this and they're willing to spend more on something that's organic. And we need to be working in Washington, D.C. to upgrade organic to make it meet what citizens believe it means. But right now, I would say there's a little bit of an inconsistency between what people think organic means and what it really does mean. Yeah.
But you see a time when organic foods and produce become more affordable so that more people can eat.
Yeah. Yeah, do I see a time when organic foods and produce will become more affordable? I do. And I think I'm not sure how quickly that's going to happen. But there are sometimes what you can do is you can go to farmers markets, and they'll oftentimes have organic produce there, and just sort of wait till the end when everybody's going home. Or there's also CSA's, community-supported agriculture programs, when you have, you invest at the beginning of the growing season, and that requires a lump sum of capital up front. And that might not be possible, but for those where it is possible, you invest, and then over the course of the growing season, you get something, you know, you get part of the harvest. And that's another, that can be another very affordable way to do it if you can, you know, front the money to the grower. But I think these things are going to be coming down in price, and it's growing. Something like over 10% of the produce now sold in this country is organic. So this is becoming more than just a niche market. It's really becoming a significant part of the market now. Yeah. Ah, okay. She says she grows things, and by the way, that is another good way to get food, growing food, you know, growing tomatoes, or even container gardening in a more urban setting, or there's also a Food Not Lawns movement where people are actually tearing up their lawns and planting vegetables. And then the second part of her question is, do I think, she thinks maybe plants have feelings. Do I think plants have feelings? And, you know, my response to that is, I don't know. I mean, they don't have a nervous system like we do and like other animals do. So I think it's more obvious and clear that, you know, cows and pigs and chickens have feelings and suffer. Now, I can't say plants don't suffer, you know, because I honestly don't know. But what I would say is that if plants do suffer, and if we want to limit their suffering, eating plants directly is the way to do that, instead of raising all these plants, killing all these plants, feeding all these plants to animals, and then killing the animals. So even if one was to accept the idea that plants are sentient and suffer, and we want to limit their suffering, eating plants directly is the way to do that. Yeah.
What do you think is the best way to advocate
What's the best way to advocate on behalf of farm animals? You know, I think talking about the cruelty to animals and factory farming is pretty disturbing and upsetting to a lot of people. So I think one of the best ways to advocate on behalf of farm animals is to show people how wonderful plant-based food can be, how tasty and satisfying. Before coming over here, I had this massive dinner. It was totally delicious, with like 3 different kinds of desserts. There was an apple crisp, cookies, and these like chocolate bark things. And I ate a bunch of that after eating 2 full plates of other great vegan food. And notice how I talk about all the sweets. Well, they're right in my head. So I think just showing what kind of food is available is very important. And that's a very good way, I think, to advocate for this lifestyle. And because I think a lot of people, one of the reasons people are somewhat resistant is they feel that they cannot get the nutrients they need. I wouldn't like the food. It's just too difficult. But, you know, the idea that we can't get the nutrients is just an enormous myth. You know, we grow up in this country believing we need to drink or we need to eat meat for protein. And we also believe that we need to drink cow's milk to get calcium so we don't get osteoporosis, right? We've all heard this. Well, if drinking cow's milk prevented osteoporosis, we shouldn't have osteoporosis in this country because we drink a lot of cow's milk and we also have a lot of osteoporosis. That's clearly not the answer. And in terms of meat, we can get all the proteins we need from plant foods, not animal foods. But I think just showing that there's great food out there and that it can be obtained without causing suffering, without causing so much destruction to the planet, and it can be satisfying and tasty and provide us everything we need. And so I think just having people over for meals, or when you go to potlucks, bringing meals, or taking people to restaurants that have good vegan food, and through the food, I think the stomach is the way a lot of people are going to ultimately get this message.
I had a question wondering how the people who speak out against the cruelty of factory farming would respond to the potential negative economic impacts of removing factory farming from the country. Certainly, it's kind of a sensitive economic time. Potential job losses. So I wondered what the response from the anti-factory farming movement would be.
Yeah, so the question has to do with the economic consequences of, you know, the end of factory farming, basically, you know, and right now we're in a pretty tough economic situation. Well, what I would suggest is that our factory farming business is very costly to us. There's these external costs associated with industrialized animal agriculture. You know, tax money supports the production of corn and soybeans as feed crops to be fed to these animals. And if we had to pay the real price for those feed crops, they wouldn't be used as feed. It would not make economic sense. So we're already subsidizing this industry. And then we have our healthcare costs. We could save something like 70% of our healthcare costs by shifting to a healthier food system. So there's big costs associated with that. Then there's our fossil fuels. You know, in order to obtain plentiful supplies of cheap fossil fuels, we spend a lot of money and cost a lot of lives. So there's that cost. So these are what they call externalities in economics. And so there's enormous externalities. And if you start calculating those in, our factory farming system is actually pretty expensive when you really get down to it. And so I think, you know, digging into the real costs of the way we're producing food now, and then ultimately calculating what makes sense, we would see, I think, a revolution away from this animal-based food system. And I think we're in the midst of it. You know, farmers markets are starting to pop up, and people are starting to recognize that they need to take more control of their own food and their own lives and eat in a way that is healthier and is better for them. Yeah.
I guess my question kind of coincides with that. A friend of mine grew up working on a family farm and recently had to sell because it was too expensive for them to run their seasonal any help from the government
Yeah.
for a subsidy. So I'm just wondering about that shift from small
Yeah.
factory farming, why it seems like it's almost impossible for.
Yeah, no, the point, your friend was on a small family farm and recently, had to sell it because they were having a hard time making a living. And that is sadly a common story. A lot of these small farms have been pushed out of business by these industrial farms who are able to get these government subsidies and who are forcing the small ones out of business. That has been the trend for the last 50 or 60 years. But I'm happy to say that there's also now a counter trend, and how strong it is and how much staying power it has remains to be seen. But what we have now are people that are actually going back to the farm. We have young people. There's woofers. I don't know if you've heard of them, workers on organic farms. These are like young people that go and volunteer at farms and help raise food. And you also have people from colleges that are starting to get into farming. They want to do something meaningful that has got substance. I was at Michigan State University, and they have a big factory farm type of program there. But then they also have this organic student-run farm that's run, interestingly, by a lot of English majors and like art majors. And they're growing some great organic produce, and now they're starting to work with people in Detroit to do community gardens. So you do have a number of things happening right now, and it's very complex and interesting to see. But I do believe that there are opportunities for people to grow organic produce and to sell them at farmers markets and to sell them with a higher profit margin, so it's quality food instead of quantity food, and also to do value-added products, to make like jellies and jams or whatever out of, fruits, and also to do crafts, to like make braided garlic things, So there's these types of opportunities that exist, And even on an old farm, some of those old farm implements, you take like an old plow and get somebody that's artistic with a welding machine, you can do some pretty fun stuff. And people are doing that too. They're taking some of these old farm implements and making them into art. So, and then there's ecotourism, bed and breakfasts, where people are encouraging folks to visit the farms and they stay over there. Corn mazes, pumpkin patch, pick your own kind of thing. So there's starting to be these types of innovative, new, healthful operations that are starting to pick up some steam. And I think that is where a lot of future might exist for farms. All righty. Maybe one more question? Yeah.
You mentioned that coming up.
All right. Okay, yeah.
You have a new third location in California. Can you just speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, we have a new third location in California. Could I just speak about it a little bit? Yes. There was a sanctuary there in the LA area called Animal Acres. It was a small sanctuary, and they were having a hard time running it, basically, in terms of the finances and just managing it. So their board contacted us and asked us if we would be willing to take it on. And we decided that yes, we would. We think LA is a very important city. There's a lot of potential to reach a big audience in LA, including through the media and through celebrities and so on. So we decided to take it on, and it's a 26-acre farm in the town of Acton, which is in LA County. It's about 45 minutes north of downtown LA. And so we're open there on weekends for visitors, and we take care of about 70 animals there right now. So that's our third sanctuary, is in Acton, just outside of Los Angeles. I don't have pictures of it yet, but before too long I think I will. So there's not an overnight cabin there currently. Actually, maybe I'll take a couple more questions. I think yeah.
All right, so I stopped eating meat about 4 months ago, but I still eat fish. What are your thoughts about fish?
Okay, you stopped eating meat a few months ago, but you still eat fish, and what are my thoughts about fish? Well, I think fish have feelings. They are not as much like us as mammals. So, and it seems to me that the more different an animal is from us, the more difficult it can be for us to understand them. So it's easier to identify with a pig or a cow because they're mammals. Chickens are a little different, so it's a little harder. And fish are even a little more different, so it's even a little more harder. But these are sentient creatures. They have feelings. They have emotional lives. A friend of mine is a psychologist in New York City. She has fish in a tank, and she will go over to the tank, and they will come to the top, and she will pet them. I saw something on YouTube not too long ago, and I don't know if anybody else here saw it, but it was a woman who was a scuba diver. And there was this eel. She would go down, and she wanted to befriend this eel, and she started feeding this eel. But the eel at first was very standoffish and had to have anything to do with her. But over time, and over a couple of years, this eel started recognizing her and started recognizing that when she came, she was going to feed the eel, and the eel started liking that, and the eel started being very friendly towards her. And now, last YouTube piece I saw, this eel is like loving on her. You know, kind of like a dog would be kind of rubbing up against you. This eel was doing this with this woman. So these animals have feelings and they have memories. And at the end of the day, we don't need to eat them. And the way the fish business has been is we have these trawlers that have destroyed enormous expanses of the ocean and cause lots of death and lots of destruction. And we don't have to do that. And again, these are feeling creatures that would rather live, and we can live without eating them. So that's my belief on that. And I realize everybody's got to make their own choice. You know, so if somebody's going to eat these products, you know, that's up to each of us to decide. But eating less is better than eating more. Did you? Yeah. Okay, so about farm sanctuary, how many animals do we bring in? How do we sustain them? And what kind of stuff do we do? Well, and where do they come from? How do we select which ones to bring in? Well, we have the 3 operations, and between the 3 farms, we currently care for about 1,000 animals. From year to year, the number of animals that we bring in varies wildly. There have been times when we've rescued over 1,000 animals from one rescue. And there's been other times when we don't bring in animals for a few months at a time. So the incoming animals varies wildly. But over the course of an average year, it might be 300 or so animals that would come in. And these are animals that usually come from cruelty cases where, you know, one of our investigators or one of our members or supporters will find an animal neglected, you know, on a dead pile or at a farm where they're suffering and are not going to be given proper veterinary care. Or in some cases, SPCAs will actually move in and remove animals from these bad situations. Or somebody who works at a farm might see an animal that's in bad condition and contact us and ask us to help. There was a guy out in California, for example, who's driving a rendering truck. Now, renderers go and pick up dead animals to take to the rendering plant where they're boiled, basically, and turned into animal feed or into fertilizer. So this is a place that picks up the dead bodies and turns them into some kind of product that can be sold. So this renderer was called to a farm to pick up a calf, and the calf wasn't dead yet. So he called us and brought the calf to us. So sometimes people in the industry will actually contact us. And the way that we sustain this work is through our membership. We currently have about 250,000 members and supporters who support us and give us financial help. And that allows us to do this. We have an Adopt a Farm Animal program where people can adopt an animal who lives at Farm Sanctuary. And for Thanksgiving, which is coming up, we have an Adopt a Turkey program where people can adopt a turkey that lives at Farm Sanctuary instead of eating one for Thanksgiving. So that's another of our programs. And people who adopt a turkey get a picture of the turkey they help save. And we also are having events at our farms. On the Saturday and Sunday before Thanksgiving, we're having celebrations for the turkeys where we will be feeding them instead of eating them. They will be the guests of honor instead of the main course. So we do that every year for Thanksgiving, and we'll be doing it this year on the next weekend. On Saturday, I'm going to be in Orland, California for our celebration for the turkeys. Then I take a red eye to Watkins Glen, New York, and I'll be there on Sunday for our celebration for the turkeys in Watkins Glen. So if anybody would like to come, we'd love for you to come visit for that. It's beautiful to be out there and see these turkeys digging into the squash and the pumpkin pie, and they're splatting it around, and the kids love it. It gets on people's faces and stuff. It's a good, fun event, fun, positive event. So, okay, well, I guess we'll end it with that. So thank you all very much again for all your time and